Hi, Dr. Crone here. Today we're going to talk about interest groups. What is an interest group? Your book defines an interest group as any organization that actively seeks to influence public policy. Interest groups are a type of linkage organization. We already studied political parties, which are another type of linkage organization. Examples of interest groups are the National Rifle Association. That's probably the best known one. I find students are usually pretty familiar with that. But there are many other types of interest groups, some of which are very, very different from the NRA. For example, a labor union like the AFL-CIO, which is an umbrella labor organization, is an interest group. Even business organizations like the Association of Realtors is an interest group. So there are many different kinds of interest groups, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later in the lecture. Before we do that, though, I want to compare interest groups and political parties since you've already had a chance to study political parties. Parties and interest groups are both linkage organizations, as we said, and they provide an opportunity for citizens to participate in what's called collective action, meaning that citizens can work together. There's strength in numbers, and they can work together with people who share their political views and share what the political goals that they have. Both parties and interest groups mobilize citizens, meaning they give citizens a chance to participate in politics, to take action. And both of them represent policy positions, which means that if you, for example, are in favor of protecting gun rights, you can join the NRA, or you can find a party, in this case the Republican Party, that represents that position. However, there are some real differences between interest groups and political parties. One difference is in what their goal is. The goal of a party is to win elections, and it is to control government offices through the election process. As a result, they have to have, especially in the United States where we have two major parties only, they have to have a broad appeal, meaning they have to appeal to as many people as they possibly can. Whereas interest groups do not have the goal of controlling government or winning elections. Their goal is to change public policy to fit what their policy position is, or to try to keep public policy the same. For example, I'll keep coming back to the National Rifle Association because so many people know about that and understand what its purpose is. The goal of the NRA is not to win elections, but rather to maintain current levels of gun rights and to be sure that new laws aren't passed that would limit those rights. Therefore, interest groups have a much more narrow appeal. Since they're not trying to win a whole election that requires a majority of voters, they can appeal to a specific subgroup of people, all of whom are usually pretty similar to each other in their desires. There's two types of interest groups. Economic groups are the most powerful types of groups. They include business groups, labor groups, meaning labor unions, farm groups. They're sort of a subset of business groups, but there are groups that represent specific types of farm commodities, such as the Soybean Growers Association, or professional groups like the Group of Realtors or the Bar Association for lawyers. Citizens groups are different. Citizen groups are groups similar to the NRA, or at least that's one type of citizen group. Citizen groups represent ordinary people, not business people. So citizens groups might be social groups. For example, there are interest groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. I know that word colored sounds old-fashioned and a little jarring to us today, but back when the NAACP was founded in the very early 1900s, that was a common and fairly respectful way to refer to an African American. But the NAACP remains an interest group that represents a specific social grouping of people of the African American race. There are single issue groups such as the National Rifle Association or NARAL, which is the National Abortion Rights Action League, that only represent one particular side of one political issue. And then there are ideological groups like the National Conservatives Union, the American Civil Liberties Union, things like that that tend to represent more along those lines of the government's, an idea about the government's proper size and role in America. The two groups differ from each other. Economic groups, the important thing to know is that the reason for joining an economic group is because of an economic incentive. In other words, joining an economic group will somehow benefit the person or the members' bottom line, their ability to make a profit. And they tend to have closed membership. An easy example would be the National Association of Realtors. You can't be a member of that association unless you are actually a licensed realtor. Similarly, the American Bar Association is only limited to lawyers. Citizen groups, though, are different. They have what we call a purposive incentive for joining. So people join citizen groups because they want to achieve a certain purpose that is non-economic. They're not trying to make a profit or to get more money. They are trying to promote a worthy goal, such as protecting gun rights or advocating for abortion rights or something like that. And citizen groups tend to almost always have open membership, meaning that anyone can join them. If you want to become a member of the NRA, feel free to pause this recording and go ahead and get on their website and join. Same with NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League. They'll be happy to have you. Whatever your position happens to be, you will be welcome to become a member of an interest group, and there aren't any requirements for that other than agreeing with the group's purpose and paying a membership fee. Before we can talk about the sort of a really important issue with interest groups, we need to define a term. And that term is a public good. And the reason we talk about public goods when we talk about interest groups is that interest groups are often provide what's called or advocate for what's called public goods rather than private goods. A public good has a certain set of characteristics. Economists are the people who define and discuss public goods, and we share with political economists an understanding of what a public good is. A public good is something that can benefit everyone, in contrast to a private good, which only benefits a particular person or a particular subgroup. So, for example, if a law said that lawyers were able to make more money, let's say, or by deducting a certain amount of the cost of their business from their taxes, that would be a private good because it doesn't benefit everyone. It only benefits lawyers. Public goods are things that benefit everyone, and they're non-rival, meaning that it's not a zero-sum game. One person enjoying that public good does not mean other people can't. A really good example of a public good would be the clean air. I think clean air is usually considered the ultimate public good. You and I can both enjoy it at the same time, and my enjoyment of that is not limited by how much of it you breathe. The other thing about public goods is they're non-excludable, meaning nobody can be stopped from getting that. So even someone who doesn't like clean air and would prefer not to have clean air laws still benefits from clean air laws by being able to breathe the air. You can't pass a Clean Air Act that only gives clean air to the people who supported that act. So clean air is an example, but also things like just maintaining roads or maintaining the national defense. Um, Actions that would, almost all environmental actions, but a lot of actions the government takes actually are public goods. They're non-excludable and they're non-rival. Citizen groups are more likely to advocate for public goods than business or economic groups. Not exclusively. Sometimes economic groups argue for things that end up being a public good, but more likely if you're going to have an interest group advocating for a public good, it's more likely that it's going to be a citizen group. And that actually presents a big problem for citizen groups. It's a problem that all interest groups share, but it's one that falls heavier and is a heavier burden on citizen groups. And that is the free rider problem. The fact that the outcome of lawmaking in general is usually non-excludable means that people who support a particular perspective and would benefit from it, can benefit from it if other people spend their time and money advocating for it, and that person, the lazy person, doesn't. So that's what we call a free rider. A free rider is someone who doesn't contribute money or resources or time to the solution of a problem, but they get to benefit from it just as much as the people who gave money. And if we go back to our clean air example, if you take an environmental group like, say, the Sierra Club, if you join the Sierra Club and give them a donation of your money, and maybe you even show up with them for a political protest or a march or something to try to clean the air, and let's say Congress passes a tougher version of the Clean Air Act because of your interest group's actions, that will absolutely benefit you, but it will also benefit anybody else who went along, who agreed with you, but didn't take any action and didn't give any money. Those people are called free riders. And this is obviously a problem, because if everyone in the country who liked clean air thought that everyone else was going to contribute, then the interest group wouldn't exist, or it would cease to exist because it wouldn't have enough money to fund its activities. So interest groups of all kinds have to overcome the free rider problem. It can even be a problem in business groups, although they tend to have more ways to overcome it. So let's talk about how interest groups could overcome that free rider problem. One way that interest groups can get around the free rider problem is simply peer pressure. And the smaller the target audience, the easier it is to use peer pressure. So in a business group that is trying to represent a whole bunch of companies, but there aren't that many companies, like say pharma, which is a group, an interest group that represents the pharmaceutical research companies in America. There aren't that many pharmaceutical companies. I don't actually know how many, but there aren't a lot, not nearly as many as there are as people who like clean air. So let's say, just for sake of argument, that there are 15 pharmaceutical companies in the United States. If 10 of them agree to form a group, and the other 5 are don't want to have to contribute some money and time and resources, the 10 other businesses can put some pressure on those and really emphasize to them how much their contribution is needed, and how much it's not fair if they just sit around and don't pay any dues. And that kind of peer pressure works best when there's a small target audience. There's also forms of coercion that sometimes groups do, especially groups that have an ability to tie the grounds for professional employment to being in the group. This is used often in groups of employees. So for example, let's just take a hairdresser. Maybe some of you are hairdressers. Hairdressers have to join a particular group in order to get licensed in their state to cut hair. Teachers also have to join teachers in public schools are usually represented by a labor union, and teachers have to join those groups in order to um, as a rule of their employment. You can't be a teacher and be employed by a public school district that's unionized without being a member of the union. So coercion is another way that you can get around the free rider problem, is somehow tying it to employment. By the way, the coercion also works in the bar association. So to practice law, you've got to be a member of the bar, and the only way to do that is joining the bar association. A little bit more subtle ways of getting around the free rider problem have to do with offering selective benefits that are either professionally or personally helpful or desirable for members only. So this can run the gamut from professional organizations that provide members with maybe a professional journal or some kind of a way to take professional development that's required. The National Rifle Association teaches firearm safety courses that are available to members, either solely to members or at a discount. If you've ever, say, gotten some kind of an award, like let's say that you join the Columbus Zoo and you get a free admission to the zoo. Or you get a cute stuffed animal in exchange for signing up for something. That is also the kind of benefit that can be offered, and that helps you get around the free rider problem. Well, you could be a free rider, but then you're not going to get this free zoo membership. Other things that tend to work are fear. These are often used, fear is often used with single issue groups. Such as the NRA. Often with their advertising, you'll see something that's designed to get people to be afraid. Our rights are under attack like never before. But that's not limited to the NRA. That's just a good example. You could see guilt. I think we've all seen those commercials for the ASPCA where they're trying to raise money for their interest group that protects animal rights by showing pictures of sad animals in bad conditions. That makes us feel guilty and we want to help. Another thing that helps is success. Advertising that, hey, this interest group has been very successful, maybe in rescuing poor animals or in protecting gun laws. We've been successful before. With your help, we can be even more successful. Those are all ways that it's basically a marketing issue of trying to get around the fact that people would prefer to get the benefits but not have to pay for them. All right, so let's say that a group has somehow managed to get around the free rider problem and has a membership and has collected those membership dues. What do they do with that money? What they do is called lobbying. And there's two kinds of lobbying. There's inside lobbying, which means inside the halls of government. So it's efforts that the interest group makes to persuade lawmakers or members of the executive branch. There's also outside lobbying, and outside influence, outside lobbying is trying to get individual members who are not politicians active somehow, getting them engaged, to mobilize, to participate, whether that's getting them interested in voting or getting them interested in contacting their legislature or something like that. So first, we're going to focus on inside lobbying. And I think I use this classic picture of the person with the suit and the briefcase walking up the white marble steps, mostly because I think that's our typical understanding of a lobbyist. And certainly that is absolutely what people hired to work on behalf of interest groups do. Well, they wear nice clothes, but they mostly go to the White House or other agencies of the government or to Congress or to state legislatures or the governor's office in order to try to do work that will influence the outcome of laws. So let's look at what we mean by inside lobbying, because there are a lot of different activities. And some people also have misimpressions of what lobbying actually is. One of the most important things that lobbyists do is they work directly with members on congressional committees, and in particular, members who already agree with their position. If you remember the fact that congressional committees are where the big efforts and big outcomes of government actually happen. This is where bills get edited and amendments get put on and things get taken in and put in and taken out, I'm sorry, of bills. This is a place where lobbyists can be really influential. They will call up a lawmaker who's on a committee and say, hey, you're on the Agriculture Committee. I see you're meeting to discuss farm subsidies, and I just want to remind you that the Soybean Growers Association is really behind this one particular amendment that we want you to pass. We're hoping that you'll work with us on that. That's an example of a really common kind of lobbying activity. They also work, and this is probably less well known, they also work with people in the federal agencies who are in a position to influence the implementation of laws, how a law is carried out, what those little provisions are, how much enforcement there's going to be. Their attempt is to influence the decision-making of both bureaucracies and Congress, and working with their friends rather than their enemies. So, for example, a lawmaker will not, let me get back. Sorry, I'm not ready to go on to the bribes yet. A lawmaker will not, or a lobbyist will not waste their time trying to convince a lawmaker who is on the opposite side of a particular issue. If you've ever tried to argue with a friend about gun control or gay marriage, you understand why. It is just a waste of everybody's time and energy. Rather, what they do is seek out lawmakers who already agree with them on a basic issue. Who are the NRA's friends in Congress? They're the people who also believe in keeping gun rights. And what the NRA does is to try to influence those lawmakers to make sure that the bill looks the way that the NRA would like the bill to look. Make sure they keep out anything from the bill that somebody who's a quote enemy of theirs would try to put in. So they're not wasting their breath trying to talk to people who don't agree with them. Now, it is true, moving on to the bribes, that it's a misconception that most interest group activity is based on giving money in exchange for votes. That is almost never happens. For one thing, laws against that are very strict and fairly strictly enforced, especially at the national level. And most interest groups don't want to mess around with that when they, which could derail all of their activities. Instead of money and illegal money, what they really have to contribute to people is information. And that, in order to understand that, you have to understand the difficulty of the job of a lawmaker. It is very difficult to know everything there is to know about all of the bills that a lawmaker is required to vote on. And even in a congressional committee where people can become experts on things like agricultural policy, they're not necessarily going to know and understand and have time to fully deal with all of the complications of potential legislation. And so lawmakers are always seeking easy to understand and digest information about what is this bill designed to do? What are the projections about whether this is going to be a good thing or a bad thing for the country or this policy area? And interest groups spend money hiring researchers and people who specifically are designed to say, so when a lawmaker says to you, or when you say to a lawmaker as a lobbyist, I want you to vote for this bill on soybeans, and you can say, tell me exactly what you guys want in there and why. And they'll say, well, of course we will. And here's a 10-year projection about how good of an effect this is going to have on soybean production and the agricultural sector of the gross domestic product. They're ready with that information. Often they publish it and have a great paper to hand out or a slick brochure or something like that. And that is what most lobbyists have to give that is valuable to members, especially members of Congress. The money that they spend usually just buys access. The bribery, again, is very, very low, but the amount of money spent is very, very high. But that money goes towards paying the salary of lobbyists and paying the lobbying firms, for interest groups to have offices and in centers of government where they want to have an influence, and for paying staff members to research, publish things, market the group, maintain contact lists of representatives and particularly representative staff, that kind of thing. And it's a lot of money. The top spending, this chart just shows you the top spending from a couple years ago. And a couple things to notice. First of all, this is a lot of money. Hundreds of millions of dollars being spent by one particular group in specifically, the Chamber of Commerce. But you can also see here the big difference in between the economic groups and the citizen groups. So all of these top 10 are some form of economic group, and that's real common. Every once in a while you'll see a citizen group break into the top. If there is one, it's usually the American Association of Retired Persons. But these are the folks, these groups are the folks that have a lot of influence on lawmakers. Again, not because they're trying to convince somebody that doesn't agree with them, but just they are able to mobilize their supporters in Congress and in the bureaucracy and say, hey, the National Association of Realtors needs your help. There is definitely a dark side of lobbying, and there are critiques of that, which are important to understand. One of the critiques is of the nature of personnel in lobbying efforts and interest group efforts, is that there's what people call a revolving door, which is that former legislators who lose office or decide not to seek re-election often become very highly paid lobbyists in the same areas that they learned about and became expert in when they were in Congress. An example of that would be, let's say there's a very high position member of Congress who's been the chair of the Health and Human Services Committee dealing with health insurance regulation. And they retire from Congress and get hired as a lobbyist for a health insurance agency's interest group, and basically health insurance interest groups. That kind of thing happens a lot. That revolving door of insiders is often what people refer to when they say the swamp of DC, is the influence that legislators and lobbyists have kind of on each other's careers. Another critique is that this is an insider's game, that you have to be really a very rich group to hire a experienced lobbyist who's good at getting legislation passed and helping, shepherd legislation through the complex process. And that it's only the best funded interest groups that are able to hire at that level, which means that you can have a good cause and you can make an interest group for yourself, but it is not as easy to get influence if you're a lowly little citizens group as it is for big business too. Another critique is that in general, the biggest influence that interest groups have is blocking legislation rather than encouraging legislation. It depends what you think of the legislation, I guess, whether it's good or bad that it got blocked. But sometimes that will contradict public opinion. And one example of that, going back to the NRA, is that we know for sure that it's very, very, very difficult, if not impossible, in this particular political climate to pass national gun control legislation, despite the fact that majorities of the American public agree with relatively small kinds of gun control regulations, such as a national registry program for gun owners, or increasing an age limit, having a national age limit for gun ownership, and things like that. But the NRA is very well organized and very good at blocking legislation that doesn't represent their members' perspectives, or that would hurt their eventual goals. And so some people critique not just the NRA, but I mean many interest groups block what seems like it has a high support among the public. Okay, so what's outside lobbying? Outside lobbying is also spending outside of the halls of government. So when we talk about outside lobbying, we're talking about efforts that don't have to do with the interest group directly working with and advocating for particular lawmakers or even members of the bureaucracy, but rather engaging their membership in two different areas. One is grassroots lobbying and one is fundraising for campaign contributions. So grassroots lobbying is a term that really refers to any kind, using the membership of a group, whether that is a business group or a citizens group, using the membership to put pressure on policymakers rather than hiring somebody in DC, which would be inside lobbying. It means, for example, maybe getting all the members to contact their legislators and ask them to vote a certain way or go against a vote. Staging media events that they think will get lots of media coverage and get their cause mentioned. This picture here is a picture of the National Abortion Rights Action League, the Ohio branch, and they're actually in a grassroots protest in the Ohio Senate. They dressed up like people from the TV show The Handmaid's Tale, which is also a book, in order to protest abortion law. They weren't really necessarily trying or assuming they were going to be able to sway the lawmakers when they made a vote. They were trying to sort of stage a colorful event that would get them lots of news coverage, which it absolutely did. Feel free to look up more about that. Just look up NARAL, Handmaid's Tale, Ohio, and you'll see the full story and what they were trying to get. Another thing that they do often is tell their members how to vote. They may even register people to vote or try to have voter registration drives, or they will specifically say the National Abortion Rights Action League endorses so-and-so for president because they support abortion rights or whatever. And they often do that in lots of races, not just the presidential race. Okay, the other kind of outside lobbying is collecting, interest groups collect citizen donations that are given, that can be distributed to candidates who are running for office who support the interest group's issue positions. Now, that's what we call a PAC. Please note that a PAC is really different than lobbying. PAC contributions are given directly to candidates. And they're not bribes, they're legal donations which are regulated by federal law, that it basically gives citizens a way to contribute, especially if they're going to give a small amount to a political candidate, to funnel it through a PAC so that their donation makes a bigger impact. For example, if just you gave money to a challenger for Congress who was really in favor of, whoops, I don't know why I can't go back. Oh, shoot. Rats. Okay, well, I can't get back to my slide. I'm not exactly sure how to back up on this thing. So if we just think about PACs again for a moment, and then I'll talk a little bit about how they influence elections. But if you as a citizen wanted to give money and you were in favor of gun rights, just giving a candidate $20 or $100 wouldn't necessarily make a big difference to that candidate in their ability to win office. But if you give that money to the National Rifle Association's Political Action Committee, they will pool it together with lots and lots of other people's donations, and then their donation to a candidate, they give donations to many candidates, can make a big difference. Okay, so how do PACs use? Most PACs are associated with businesses. Another reason why business PACs, business interest groups tend to have more power because they have more campaign money to give away. PACs give more heavily to incumbents, no matter what kind of a PAC it is. They prefer to choose somebody who is already a proven winner, rather than what they would consider wasting their money on someone who may not be able to get reelected. That's more true with businesses than it is with citizen groups, who often will be more willing to give money. Like NARAL would give money to a challenger who was supporting abortion rights if they felt like the other person, the incumbent, was really against abortion rights, and they were, they wanted to help the pro-choice candidate as much as they could. But in businesses especially, mostly just give to incumbents. All of the contributions, both your donations and the amount of contributions PACs can make, are limited by federal and state electoral law. However, there have been changes in that, and an important court decision that has loosened or allowed more freedom and spending for interest groups in campaigns. And that was the decision that the Supreme Court made in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, or the FEC. And that ruling happened in 2010. And basically what it allows, it's a complicated case, and there's a lot of good YouTube videos and other summaries of it, so I invite you to learn more about it if you'd like. But we're mostly just going to talk here about the results of it. Basically, the Supreme Court said that political spending on someone or something's behalf is protected speech under the First Amendment, meaning that it can't be limited. That's actually based on precedent in the law, which was done before this happened. So, for example, you can only donate up to a certain amount to a PAC or to a candidate, and that amount that you as an individual can give is limited. But if you are rich and would like to spend a lot of money and create your own political ad in order to help a candidate get elected, not something they told you to do and are paying you to do, but something you just decide on your own, I'm going to make an ad helping this person, you're allowed to do that. That is protected speech. What Citizens United added on to precedent was the interpretation that organizations, which includes corporations and labor unions, have the same First Amendment rights of free speech as individuals. That's a new interpretation of the Constitution. And what that did was open the door for corporations, political parties, labor unions, and other organizations to spend as much as they would like on behalf of someone. And this has led to what are called super PACs, which can therefore have unlimited spending. So the Citizens United decision overturned federal election regulations on spending on behalf of candidates, on organization spending on behalf of candidates, and has led to the development of groups called super PACs, which can take unlimited contributions and can spend unlimitedly on behalf of a candidate. If you've ever watched a campaign commercial and at the end it says paid for by, and then you hear the name of something that sounds really great, like Citizens for American Progress or something, that is a super PAC. If it says I am Donald Trump and I endorse this message, that means it is not from a super PAC, it's actually from the candidate's campaign. I'll leave you with the question of whether you feel interest groups are good for democracy or not.